Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm especially excited about today's event because it has a lot of personal significance for me, not just because I'm interested in the history of the Berlin Wall. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mary Cerati. I'm the author of the book Collapse, The Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall. I was an undergraduate here about 100 years ago, and after that I had a fellowship from the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, to study in West Berlin, and that turned out to be in 1989. So that was where my interest in this topic originated, and I have persisted in my interest in this topic to this day. And it's really wonderful to welcome my friend Axel Klausmeier here today. And also we have Dailan Xu. Let me first explain a short word about Dailan Xu. When I was an undergraduate here all those years ago, and I had never been to any foreign countries except Canada, I really wanted somehow to get to Germany. And back then, Harvard's attitude was, we're the only important place of learning on earth. Why would you possibly want to go anywhere else? So there was active discouragement of study abroad or anything like that. Now, times have definitely changed for the better, but that was not really an option. So I started looking for summer internships, and I had no connections, nothing. And a very nice lecturer in the German department helped me and found me an internship. Basically, I was working in the mail room of Schering in West Berlin, which meant I reported to work at 6 a.m. And I delivered mail, and I learned how to drink with breakfast, because after you delivered mail for 3 hours, you got breakfast on the company dime, and that usually was alcoholic. And then we did another mail delivery, which was noticeably less accurate than the first mail delivery. And then we were off for the day by about 1 o'clock. So it was great. So basically, after, doing my mail delivery, I basically had the rest of the day to explore the city, and it was kind of the poor woman's German language course. And I just, that time was really so formative for me. So fast forward to about, a year ago, and Elaine says to me, we have this amazing student, you have to find her an internship in Germany because she wants one. And she's going to major in history and German studies, class of 27. And I was like, oh my God, I have so many things to do. I can't. I thought, no. All those years ago, that lecturer found me an internship, so I'm going to make this happen. So I'm very grateful to Axel, because I called Axel. And Axel said, of course I have room for a brilliant young student who is from Beijing originally, so speaks Chinese and English and is learning German. I don't even know what other languages you speak. Spanish, and Dailan is actually going to talk about her experience shortly. So this is just one sign of how wonderful Axel is. I feel very fortunate to count him among my friends. Axel, in a previous life, did a PhD at Bochum in the history of architecture, history of landscape architecture, working particularly on a British architect. He spent many years in Britain, so we forgive him his British accent. He spent time in the other Cambridge, not the right Cambridge. And he then went on to win an insanely competitive process to become the director of the Berlin Wall Foundation. And he has since gone from strength to strength as the leader of the Berlin Wall Foundation. It has grown in importance. It has always basically been charged with a duty of care for the remaining portions of the wall in Berlin. But under Axel, it has truly grown and expanded. It's taken on the East Side Gallery, with which some of you might be familiar. He's also been instrumental in creating an important walkway through the city where the wall used to be. That required no small amount of negotiation with private property owners and so forth. And I think Axel might know more about Berlin politics than just about anyone else. As a minor sidebar, because Axel is de facto in charge of what is left of the Berlin Wall and the East Side Gallery, anyone who comes to Berlin wants to see that and therefore calls Axel. So to make a long story short, he has a very impressive collection of photos of his office, of himself with Michelle Obama and the girls, of himself with Prince Harry, and so forth. Because if you come to Berlin, you want to see the wall, and to do that, you have to talk to Axel. So the number of times I've looked at a German media site and someone is in Berlin to see the wall and standing next to them is my friend Axel, I've completely lost count. So if you want to know what Prince Harry was really like, what it's like to run the Berlin Wall Foundation, Axel is your man. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to have Dailan first talk about her internship experience at the Berlin Wall Foundation in Axel's office, and then we'll have Axel, who's talking today, 35 years after the wall, now being very serious about the values of 1989 and today's democratic challenges, which are numerous. Speaking personally, when I was in West Berlin in 1989 and then in the years following, I did not think that in the course of my lifetime, we would again be seeing major land war in Europe. We would again be looking at nuclear threats from Moscow to Western Europe. And then, of course, the results of the election last week have raised very big questions about U.S. foreign policy. I actually, if I'm slightly breathless, I've actually just come from a long session over at the Kennedy School on the future of foreign policy, question mark, under the second Trump administration with various former policymakers. So we're happy to get into that in the question and answer session. So let's start with Dailan, and then we'll have Axel's remarks, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Dailan?
Thank you, Professor Sarati, for the very kind introduction. So I'm very honored today to welcome you to the Minda Diggensberg Center for European Studies and for this very special talk. I'm Dailan. I'm a sophomore student at Harvard College studying history and German studies with a secondary in European history, politics, and society. I'm interested in the shifting paradigms of comparative historiography and encounters of thoughts between China and Europe in the 19th and 20th century, and also in the broader themes like memory politics, ethnicity, transformation of empires, and national identity. I came to Harvard knowing for sure that I want to study history and be a historian. I also knew that I hoped to begin a new language. Because of my love for classical music and philosophy, I chose German. During my first semester here, I took intensive German class and also German social thought with Professor Peter Gordon, which is one of the most rewarding courses I've taken here so far. For my first college summer, I really hope to combine both of my wish to be in Germany, especially in Berlin, to enhance my language learning and also to work on something relating to history. So Elaine and Professor Sarati and CES really made my wish come true. As someone interested in the effect of imposed borders and the shaping of people's perception of identity, I am very lucky to be able to intern at the Stiftung Berliner Mauer, where I met Dr. Axel Klausmeier and other historians, educators, and curators who work on presenting the history of the Berlin Wall to the public. One of the very unforgettable moments of my time there was when Dr. Klausmeier gave me a tour of the Parliament of Trees. It was a very unique green site among the parliament buildings with many artistic inputs to criticize the brutality of war and violence and convey the message of peaceful coexistence of trees and humanities and the environment. It was a very special tour, as Dr. Klausmeier also loves gardens and architecture, and also the theme of the place really speak true to the many wars and violence that still happen around the world. I also made visits to other sites of the foundation, including the East Side Gallery, the Marienfelde Refugee Center, and Checkpoint Charlie, and we talk about the history of the wall and the division of Berlin. It was such a learning experience I will not get from a pure classroom setting. I also helped with a research project at the Checkpoint Charlie regarding the reporting of the tank confrontation in 1961 using Chinese newspaper sources. Growing up, hearing about the fall of the Berlin Wall as a defining moment in the Cold War, the Mauerfall for me, after the internship, became less as a mere symbol, but more as a detailed understanding of the GDR regime, the border control, and what it means concretely for people's daily lives in a divided Berlin during the Cold War. Memorial sites like the Berlin Wall Foundation are crucial for political and historical education and shaping the public memory of SED injustice. I was also able to join the commemoration ceremony of the building of the Berlin Wall this August, where I heard the witness accounts of the wall at the Chapel of Reconciliation at Bernauer Strasse. And in the past weekend, the Stiftung hosts its 35th anniversary of the Mauerfall in the theme of German-Polish relations, a topic that is often overlooked by the public. And in this present-day political turmoil and the rise of the far-right movements, looking back at the history of the Berlin Wall become ever more pressing. The Mauerfall and the Zeitpunkt of 1989 serve us as a reminder of the importance of remembrance culture in face of human rights issues and threats to democracy. And all of this made the work that Dr. Klaus Meyer and his colleagues do so fundamentally important. And thanks to Professor Mary Serrati, who also did the internship in West Berlin before the wall came down during her college years in Harvard, she kindly passes down this torch of cross-cultural understanding between Germany and US. I'm very eager to hear her comments today as the experts on Cold War history and international relations in the background of current-day US election politics. I saw that she was interviewed by the ZDF Heute journal last April on the subject Trump Wiederwahl wäre Katastrophe für NATO, the implication of Trump's re-election for Europe. There's no better time to discuss the challenges of democracy and the direction of world politics than now with the two experts in the room. So let us now give a warm welcome to Professor Mary Serrati.
Oh, no, to Dr. Klaus Meyer.
Oh, to Dr. Klaus Meyer.
Well, thank you both, and really impressed by what you've already said. And well, welcome to you all. And I do apologize. I have a script with me. I rather make sure that I really can say what I wanted to express, and I'm especially grateful to two friends of mine from various phases of my life who are in this room. And there's Doro, and we studied together in Munich in the early 90s, and there's Benze, and we shared a flat in London in 96. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to you all for coming this afternoon. It's wonderful to be here and to be able to speak to and later with you on a topic that fits perfectly into this series and various aspects addressed in previous lectures. My topic is highly current because it was only this last weekend that we celebrated, and that has been said, the 35th anniversary of the fall of the wall, and I'm therefore still very much under these powerful impressions. However, first of all, I would very much like to thank Mary for making having the idea really to invite me, and who encouraged and promoted my visit to Harvard. Thank you, Mary. And I would also particularly like to thank Elaine and Daniel Ziblatt and the Democracy and Its Critics Initiative, who took Mary's idea and implemented it with the help of super dedicated colleagues. And I'm looking in this direction to Susanna and several others. And finally, the Minda de Gansberg Center for European Studies at Harvard, so that I can be here as a John F. Kennedy Memorial Policy Fellow. This is a very, very great honor for me, I must say, something really special for which I'm extremely grateful. Thank you, Elaine, for making this possible. Now to my topic. I could actually start by saying that everything went well this very last weekend. As you can see, big celebrations initiated and financed by the Berlin Senate in front of the Brandenburg Gate were ended with a very impressive and emotional rock show indeed, and an estimated 500,000 Berliners and their guests attended the spectacular show despite the freezing cold. In the morning, our foundation had already carried out the official ceremony for both the federal government and the Berlin Senate at the Berlin Wall Memorial in Bernauer Straße. Bernauer Straße has been already mentioned by you. The federal president, you can see him here, several ministers of the still acting federal government, and the governing mayor of Berlin had attended our ceremony, as well as numerous members of the former East German opposition, representatives of the victims' associations of communist tyranny, high-ranking members of the former Solidarność opposition from Gdansk, representatives of public life, and last but not least, several hundred school children who proved that the young generation in particular gives a face to the commitment to the values of freedom and democracy. And at the very end, there was pure emotion, due to, I must admit, that it was planned in great detail, a flash mob. And for this flash mob, we had invited several Berlin choirs to surprise people at the end of the event. Almost all of the approximately 700 or so visitors joined in Patti Smith's iconic anthem, "People Have the Power." What better way to express the values of 1989 than through this optimistic message from 1988? After this brief atmospheric introduction, however, I would like to move on to my actual topic, to the question of how the transformation of German society is also reflected in the way the public and state memory of the Berlin Wall, and in particular, the fall of the wall, is dealt with. How has the public memory of the world event of the fall of the wall changed in recent years, and how is this change reflected in the difficult debates in today's society? What do the values of 1989 mean in a rapidly changing, increasingly diversifying society, at the edges of which populism is gnawing like a cancer? In parallel to the increased public expectations, especially among politicians, not only is German society changing rapidly, but also the memory of the GDR itself. The dictatorship is becoming more and more comic, and in the retrospect of many, it no longer seems so bad and cruel. This is also true for recent publications, such as those by the East German historian Katja Heuer, whose bestseller Beyond the Wall consistently succeeds in separating the dictatorial character of the SED state from everyday life. Together with the polemic Der Osten, a West German invention by Dirk Oschmann, Heuer's book in 2023 formed the core of a debate on the sovereignty of interpretation of GDR history, the transformation period, and East German identity. The sovereignty of interpretation addresses a key issue that is still a priority for us in Germany, even 35 years after the fall of the wall, because ultimately it seems to be about the question of who tells, or even is allowed to tell, which story about whom. Both of the books mentioned filled a gap in this discourse, namely a history of the, if that is allowed to say, of the little people, the kleinen Leute. Apparently, it has still not been possible to create a viable social image of the GDR that many people can identify with. Most people feel excluded from historical debates about the GDR. And against the backdrop of these intense discussions, our aim was once again to commemorate the anniversary of the fall of the wall with dignity and to focus on the values of 1989. Dissatisfaction with the political development in the Federal Republic in general, particularly with regard to issues of migration, border security, and thus social change, makes the joyful remembrance of the world event of the peaceful revolution, and thus the supposedly obvious core message of 1989, increasingly difficult. Other than often parallel narratives that are increasingly coming to the fore are dominating public debate. And the victory of Western values, represented by the peaceful revolution and the fall of the wall, is not only at stake in the war in Ukraine, but also in the elections to the German state parliaments, in which populists from the right and left are gaining majorities, or, as recently in the state of Brandenburg and Saxony, are becoming so influential that it's becoming considerably more difficult for democratic forces, if not impossible, to form a stable government. Our Washington-based colleague Hope Harrison did not pursue this focus extensively in her groundbreaking and most thorough book After the Berlin Wall: Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the Present, as her comprehensive study ends in 2019. The complex interdependencies in the diversification of society, the rather light-hearted memory of the fall of the wall, changing historical narratives, and finally, the challenge and threat to the democratic constitution were not yet apparent to the extent they are today. Reason enough to investigate this here and now. In the following, I will present some of the characteristics of the major wall anniversary events before concluding by analyzing the changes in the debates and putting them up for discussion. Hope Harrison, in her important book, has worked out that the politics and commemoration play an important role in Germany, and that Germans seem to suffer from, quote, anniversary mania, or rather from an anniversaritis, as Achim Landwehr calls it. Brian Ladd, however, states that the Germans, quote, may lead the world in agonized self-examination of their history, end of quote. And so far, and so Berlin faces a particular challenge when it comes to publicly commemorating the fall of the wall. It's not just the date itself, because November 9th has many connotations in German history. In addition to the date of the fall of the wall in 1889, there's above all the date of November 9th, 1938, which automatically makes remembrance multi-layered. The night of broken glass, the so-called Kristallnacht, when the Nazis attacked and destroyed Jewish homes, synagogues, businesses, and cemeteries. The violence perpetrated against Jews in the Reichskristallnacht, including murder, marked a significant turn in Nazi policies toward what would become the Holocaust. But other than commemorating the Holocaust and its countless victims, commemorating the fall of the wall has an unbeatable advantage. The story of the wall has an almost Hollywood-like happy end. Layers of history, or, as Brian Ladd named his great book, The Ghosts of Berlin. Since 2009, when there was a citywide festival to commemorate the fall of the wall for the first time, Berlin has been challenged every 5 years in a special way to organize an even more visually powerful and effective wall festival than the last time. Without doubt, the Border of Light from 2014, which still shapes the image of the official commemoration of the fall of the wall today, should be mentioned first and foremost. At the time, it succeeded in conveying the image of a city open in all directions, even without major security precautions. Since then, Berlin's city marketing has labeled the capital City of Freedom. The happy and wonderful images of the light barrier, which had been erected along 12 kilometers of the inner city course of the wall, went around the world. Looking back at the years 2009, 2014, and 19, against the backdrop of my topic, one could come to the conclusion that the world was in perfect order 15 and 10 years, and with some exceptions, even 5 years ago. With the help of state and federal funding, our foundation was able to effectively help stage the image of a successful reunification at the Brandenburg Gate, along the former inner city course of the wall, and also at the Berlin Wall Memorial to mark the 20th, 25th, and 30th anniversaries of the fall of the wall. Although there were numerous discussions in the run-up to the respective anniversaries about the self-evident lightness of the visually powerful staging, for example, about the under-complexity of the representation of the reunification process with the help of artistically designed parts of the wall in 2009, critics fell silent in each case when thousands and thousands of people gathered around the Brandenburg Gate and were ready to joyfully celebrate the fall of the wall. Here you see, for example, Wałęsa, who played an important role in that, and the bottom left with Merkel, with our then president, with Hillary Clinton and others, and someone from Russia impossible to imagine today. Yeah, thank you. As in the case of the dominoes, thousands of people had previously participated in the creation of these elements and now wanted to see what had become of them. A large celebration at the Brandenburg Gate, which was broadcast live on the public channels at prime time, with speeches by international politicians and civil rights activists, as well as a mixed music program for all ages rounded off these events.
Axel, I don't mean to interrupt you. Maybe explain briefly what the dominoes were, because people
Yeah,
don't know.
this,
Okay.
yeah, these dominoes were literally produced around the world. These were, I mean, as one can see, a sort of 2 meters high element representing the wall, and they were painted by important people, some important people, but ordinary people, classes from all over the world. And Lufthansa was the sponsor at the time, and then it was actually flown into Berlin to then have this row of dominoes, and Lech Wałęsa was the first to sort of kick it off, and then it started, because it all started with the Solidarność movement 1980 in Gdansk. However, the image of German society and its view of the GDR was no longer completely unclouded. And I would therefore, if I name 2019, this is perhaps when really intense discussions were taking place prior to the actual event. And why is that? Since October 2014, the so-called patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident, known as Pegida, had been gathering for a stroll in Dresden to demonstrate against immigration and foreign infiltration as a result of an overly liberal integration policy. And this was even before the so-called crisis in 2015, when Angela Merkel let refugees into the country. In the beginning, they attracted a handful of people only. The fact that these right-wing populists used the tradition of the peaceful Monday demonstrations of 1989 to generate attention caused public outrage, not only among the former opposition members of '89. The demonstration grew quickly to 10,000 people on December 8, 2014. During the weekly demonstrations on Monday evenings, Pegida supporters carried banners with slogans such as "For the preservation of our culture" and "Against religious wars on German soil." However, the major celebrations in Berlin had every 5 years to mark the anniversary were largely received positively, at least in Berlin itself and the Federal Republic. They must be considered, however, as milestones in the official politics of remembrance. Of course, even 5 and 10 years ago, there were heated debates about mistakes made during the reunification process. For example, by the Treuhand, a state-run institution founded to privatize the GDR state-owned enterprises according to the principles of capitalism and to, quote, ensure the efficiency and competitiveness of the companies, end of quote. East Germans very often were treated with little or no respect, and their Lebensleistungen, their lifetime achievements, were questioned in mostly very hurtful ways. It had long been clear that the blossoming landscapes promised by former Chancellor Helmut Kohl were still not in full bloom, that there was not yet a uniform wage level in East and West, and that wealth and unemployment were also completely unequally distributed. But the right-wing populism that was now taking to the streets on a weekly basis was still regarded as a regional fringe phenomenon related to Dresden and Saxony. And that changed quickly, especially when you see here a map of the EU elections from June this year. And thus, the preparatory deliberations about the what and the how of the next anniversary have been increasingly accompanied by critical discussions since 2018 and 19 at the latest, as I said earlier, about how to implement the multi-layered social debates about the right way to remember on a broad scale. In preparation for the citywide participatory main event this year, there was an extremely intense and controversial debate about how to respond appropriately to the changing world situation. In the end, we agreed to have citizens create posters on this topic under the motto "Uphold Freedom High" and based and modeled on the posters of the demonstrators in the GDR in 1989. Thousands of voices for freedom and democracy were thus ultimately visible. We wanted to involve as many people as possible, since our work has always been about the contextualization of historic events. What do the demands of 89 and 90 mean for our society today? What do they mean for me? The historical banners with the newly designed plugs were on display for 2 days in an open-air installation last week, around 4 kilometers long and along the former inner city course of the wall. Furthermore, on the evening of November 9th, Berliners were invited to become part of a huge band that played the so-called soundtrack of 89 along the route, as explained in the introduction. And in the end, 500,000 people joined together to create an experience that transcends division. Following the big concert mentioned in the beginning, the ultimate show took the stage on Sunday evening, and that was a concert by the Russian punk band Pussy Riot in the former Stasi headquarters. Where else? What a symbol of freedom. In addition to the citywide program, in which I always was intensively involved as a consultant, we at the Berlin Wall Foundation have always focused on communicating the core messages of the historical events of 89 and their significance for our society today. The importance of Western values of freedom for our daily activities, the fragility of democracy, the opportunities of the new world order after the end of the Cold War, played a central role, as well as the self-empowerment of the individual, the values of the separation of powers, and the peaceful overcoming of autocratic structures. Simultaneously, we do never forget to honor the victims. In whatever we do, we have this layer as well to work with. For all of that, we have repeatedly invited young people from several European countries to discuss the universal values of 89 in an international context, and have developed a fair variety of formats for a diverse range of target groups. All of these formats call for participatory involvement. This year, for example, among other things, we went to the suburbs of Berlin to talk to the people who might not visit our memorial sites in the first place. We talked about the values of 89 and the threats to our democracy today. And of course, this remarkable footage will wander in our archives. But only last Saturday night, we projected the video footage on the East Side Gallery, the longest remaining strip of the wall in Berlin, to evoke discussions and public debate. And this strip is approximately 1.3 kilometers long in the very center of Berlin. These videos, these interviews, were often a very special glimpse into the popular soul and the mood of the people at grassroots level. But we are fully convinced that we need to talk more with each other in a more and more polarizing society. We know that democracy is demanding, but it's very dependent on public debate. And here, Mary, have a look. As in the years before, All preparations then culminated in a comprehensive program of events on and around November 9th, including different formats such as readings, lectures, panel discussions, film screenings, dance performances, concert, temporary exhibitions, whatsoever. But above all, it includes the central commemorative event of Berlin and the Federal Republic in the morning of November 9th. The event I started my talk with today. And here are some of the things we do, some of these formats. Here, for example, we have Gauthier Capuçon, an outstanding French musician and pupil of the great Rostropovich, who played at Checkpoint Charlie on November 11th, 1989, and Gauthier Capuçon literally did the same 5 years ago, and in one of our ceremonies. Or here we invite artists to contribute to meet different expectations. On the bottom left, for example, we have an art installation with light along the former death strip in the River Spree, or the so-called Berlin handshapes invented by a Dutch artist, Michael Ziegler, where strangers met and did a sort of symbolical handshape to connect at the border. The wall is in the back of the image where it once divided people. And we invited a Swiss group of young women, and they were only 16 or 17, and they had composed and invented sort of a dancing performance, and they danced the fall of the wall. But is all of that still so easy in times when national populists, not only in Germany, are threatening democracy and publicly mocking and questioning its values? Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, Nigel Farage, the now voted out Peace Party in Poland. Unfortunately, the list could go on and on. Not even talking about the growing influence of autocratic China and expanding Russia through war. What is certain is that there is great uncertainty about how to behave in the face of increasingly brazen right-wing populist and nationalist provocations at a time when in Germany the so-called Alternative for Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, is constantly trying to shift broadly accepted moral and ethical conventions of social interaction and mutual respect. Our work is thus always about upholding and communicating the democratic values that courageous people fought for 35 years ago at great personal risk, but under favorable global political conditions. And if you look at it more broadly, the war in Ukraine is, in my opinion, ultimately about precise this issue, because Ukraine is also fighting over the outcome of the 1989 revolution and the victory of the respective freedom movements, particularly in Eastern Europe. The Western values of a democratic community are being called into question and actively fought against in more and more countries around the globe, by Putin's Russia, by China and other autocratic systems worldwide. And we shall see what both the Agenda 47 and Project 2025 will hold for the US and the rest of the world. However, I do hope that the democratic infrastructure in this country is strong enough to withstand these challenges. I want to conclude with the following remarks. In terms of remembrance policy, it is clear that the fall of the wall and German unification have changed German memory policy. First, by adding a new set of victims and then a new set of role models coupled with a new narrative about German identity. It is no longer possible to just celebrate. We need to reflect the complexity of events and political context, otherwise we are no longer credible. However, the values of 89 can serve as an inexhaustible resource for reassuring our own understanding of democracy. They are like an inexhaustible power bank. We must treat them as such and carry them with us at all times. Making people aware of this is a core concern of our daily work, and this begins with the daily practice of a respectful culture of debate and recognition of the complexity of our society, something one can only dream of in current political debates and disputes. Democracy is exhausting and demanding, I've already said that. It's ultimately about interfering in one's own affairs, as the East German civil rights activist Jürgen Fuchs once called it. It's precisely not about retreating into the bosom of the state, but about personal commitment and taking responsibility for one's own actions. The hot war is back in Europe, and we, as an institution entrusted with the world's best-known symbol of the Cold War, are working tirelessly, especially in times of growing polarization and international right-wing populism, in times of war against freedom and democracy, to convey the values of our freedom and to show that democracy and freedom cannot be taken for granted. We are committed to an open, democratic society. Our work stands for respectful coexistence and opposes all forms of individual and group-based marginalization and misanthropy. In our discussions about socio-political issues of the past, present, and future, it is important to us to draw attention to the responsibility of each individual for both themselves and society. We therefore strengthen the development of a differentiated historical awareness in society and help to anchor the value of political participation as a social responsibility. Does that sound naive to you in today's world that is yet again an entirely different one since November 5th? I would thus like to conclude with a quote from Manfred Fischer, the local pastor who was the key activist in the development and political implementation of the Berlin Wall memorial in Bernauer Straße. He was a permanent source of inspiration for many, of ideas, and a strong advocate for the ideas of freedom. Very, very early in the morning, it must have been something like 6:30 or so, we once walked along the just opened extended memorial in Bernauer Straße in 2014, and he said to me, we had just completed everything. We just was there, the bulldozers had disappeared, everything was ready with our extension work, and he said to me that morning, "We can never sit still and think our work is finished and done. Our endeavors are not about worshipping the ashes, but about passing on the fire. We must keep confronting new challenges or we won't matter," end of quote. What a wonderful responsibility this is for our work in our time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Axel. I have many comments, but I will limit myself to 3. You want to come sit? Yeah. And then I'll give Dailan, as a representative of another generation, a chance to make a couple of comments, and then you can decide whether you want to respond or not. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So just 3 thoughts on your very rich remarks. The first was your striking phrase, "It has not been possible to create an image of East Germany with which people can identify." That really struck me. I personally, some of you might remember, some of you I think were here, 10 years ago had the honor of doing an event here with former East German dissidents, people who had been arrested, interrogated, suffered very much for their efforts to try to promote openness, freedom, and democracy. And I'm happy to say that some of them have become personal friends, and I'm still in touch with them 10 years later. And one in particular, when he heard about the book you mentioned by Katja Heuer, which is a book that very much emphasizes the personal sphere, the family sphere. And I understand that's her personal choice, but she is consciously presenting a partial picture of East Germany. And so one of my dissident friends with whom I spoke here 10 years ago said, you know, if you read her book, you could come to the conclusion that East Germany was basically Austria, just with limited travel options. And he said, that's not where I spent my life. I don't recognize my East Germany. So even people who lived through it are debating, you know, how should we portray this? So that was my first thought, because we actually had this event here 10 years ago with these dissidents. Is there a recording of that? I can't remember. There's a recording. Okay, so if you're interested, you could look that up. Then my second thought is, that was a very striking image you showed of the June 2024 EU election results. The fact that there was an AfD, the right-wing party majority, basically in what used to be East Germany. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the interaction of the Ukraine war with the politics of that region, because I'm amazed at the extent to which debates about how to resolve the Ukraine war have actually been part of German politics at like the communal level, right? There are at the recent elections in the Länder and the states debated in great detail whether there should be peace negotiations or not, which is not actually something that falls to the East German Länder. That's a national initiative, right? If the state of Germany is going to take part or host peace negotiations, but that did not stop AfD candidates from making it an issue. So I'd be interested in knowing more from you, because you're closer to that than I am. And then third, another one of your many comments that struck me, you said it's no longer possible to just celebrate. As someone who works, as I said, on the history of the Berlin Wall, shameless plug, here's my book, The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall. For me, November 9th every year has been a day of celebration, because I've remembered the triumph of people like the dissidents I know over repression, over brutality. And I've been to many, those pictures he showed, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to take part in many of the Berlin celebrations, so the 10th anniversary, 20th anniversary, and so forth. And this year, it was just so sad on November 9th to think, you know, this is not, as you said, not really something we can just celebrate. This is a moment when we are again facing challenges to our freedoms. And I think you're exactly right to say we should look at this as a source of strength and draw on it in the face of the democratic challenges that are to come, particularly here in the United States. And so my last question, and then I'll go over to Dailan, is that I'm wondering if at the celebration this past weekend, and I was not there, whether there was, sadly, something of an anti-populist or even anti-American sentiment, as in, we are here, you said there are 500,000 people there, we are here to celebrate democratic values, and we've just had an election by, you know, with someone running it who says, oh, I'm just going to be a dictator, right? So this is not, you know, someone who is, shall we say, coming into office celebrating democratic values, right? We're talking about an enemies list, mass deportations, and so forth. So I was wondering if there was, sadly, in the celebration 2024, a sense of we are here to commemorate this triumph of democracy, but also to challenge populists, and in particular to challenge American populists, and say we will stand up for these values. Dailan, what thoughts did you have about Axel's talk?
Okay. Yes. I thought it was very wonderful, and it covered many things. And I think, firstly, I would like to ask about like how specifically does the foundation work with the memory concept when perhaps in Germany, like the remembrance culture is sometimes like often talked about, like how does the foundation like work specifically to like overcome the public stigma of thinking too much about the past. And then second, I'm also curious about I guess Germany's position in the world politics in response to, for instance, the election result, U.S. election result that came out last week, and how does that impact Germany's role? And you also mentioned Russia, China, and EU. So how does Germany kind of balance the relationship in between? And also, I'm just, for like personal interest, I'm very curious about what was talked at the last weekend's event about the German-Polish relation, and how was that themed carried out by the discussion? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's quite a lot, and
You can pick and choose. You don't have to
a
answer.
variety of aspects. Perhaps I would start with this. There's not a sort of a single view on what the GDR was like. Was it a dictatorship, or was it not that bad? And I mean, in Germany, it's common knowledge and has always been sort of one of the founding elements that, for example, we have a common interpretation of what Nazi Germany was like. There are no discussions about whether it was a dictatorship or not. That was clear from the beginning. I mean, let's say after 1968. But it has been completely different with the GDR and what it was. There are many factors contributing to that. There are more recent publications, the Heuer and Oschmann I mentioned, but there's a recent one by Steffen Mau, which can only be recommended. Steffen Mau, he is a social scientist, and in very great detail he analyzes what leads to this different understanding. It contributes that many people don't want to be told you were raised in a dictatorship. This is not I mean, for some, it really identifies their political life and their political way of or getting active, getting involved as an activist in 88 or 89. And so as members of the opposition, for them it's easy to follow. But if you are, perhaps if you were a member of the party, this is one thing in the East, but if you only led an ordinary life, whatever an ordinary life is, you're just a working class man or woman, did your job, and you didn't do anything obviously bad, and then you're told you were in a dictatorship, you didn't do anything against it. So that has something to do with what did you do? Why did you not fight against this dictatorship? So, and who says this? This is something about people very often from the West. So again, people from the former East are not treated with appropriate respect. But that also leads me to your second question concerning the Ukraine war and the interpretation of the Ukraine war. Great support in many areas of former East Germany for Putin's policy. And where does that come from? And I believe there are so many aspects to be mentioned, especially that people in East Germany were not really and could not be, have not learned to engage in civic commitment, in civic politics, and they have very often not learned democratic structures, values, practices. So they are now, and they were in opposition, even if they were not against the system or didn't do anything against the system in the GDR, they were kind of against any forms of hierarchy. And now this has turned around. They are against Western, our current government, but they ask for a strong leader. And they can see that they challenge democratic values, and they see in Putin a strong leader, and they see that he is putting through and challenging the Western way of life. So there is coming together many aspects of how people were raised, how they were treated over the last 30 or 35 years, and also about how they see our current German politicians and leaders. So, yeah. And that also leads to your third question, which is it's no longer possible to just celebrate, because we are now including very many various aspects into our current debates. It's not only about the fall of the wall and this incredible message of freedom is possible, walls can be overcome peacefully, which is, I believe, probably the best message Germany has ever produced. But at the same time, we do have discussions about, for example, new questions and new views on what happened. And we are more talking about, and that is what Oschmann does in particular. He's not actually focusing on the GDR and the overcoming of the wall, but what went wrong after the fall of the wall. So in this transformation process in the years from 1990 onwards. And so this has to be kept in mind. And of course, there are new questions raised by people who weren't heard of before. I give you two examples. During the last years, we have interviewed, for example, many people, people in Berlin and in other parts also of West Germany. What did the fall of the wall mean to you? And so we asked members of the Turkish community with Turkish migrants' backgrounds. And for them, the story of the fall of the wall and the reunification process is something completely different than it would have been to the majority of Germans. As a symbol of freedom for them, it's unemployment. Very simple. Because they were kicked out. East Germans were brought into cheap labor, and especially in Berlin companies, and they have their memories of the fall of the wall. They are not positive, because unemployment, and then in the years to come, there was strong racism in parts, in both East and West. And in Germany, we have these names of the towns where like Hoyerswerda, like Rostock-Lichtenhagen in the east, or but as well as Mölln and Solingen in the west, where there were fierce attacks against these migrant communities. That was a Western example. The Eastern example is that there were so-called Vertragsarbeiter from former communist countries. These were contract workers who were brought to East Germany from countries like Vietnam, like Cuba, or other parts of the world, and who were kind of really had officially no contact to East Germans and had to work and work and work. And when the wall came down, their reason for being in East Germany was simply taken away. Unemployment, kicked out of the country, treated badly, racism, and so forth. And that these are new approaches. We follow the new roads, new lines of discussion, and we include all of them. And because we are talking about rapidly changing society with many sort of people with migrants' backgrounds, and we have to include them into our narrative in general. So that's why that's is something why we cannot just longer just celebrate. Yeah. Dailan, you talked about the impact of the US election results and the impact on German politics. I mean, this week, 1.5, 2 weeks ago, when first November 5th happened and Trump was re-elected, and on the following day, the German government exploded. I mean, it was the worst moment ever that it could happen, because now we are in a situation where the German government is not only extremely weak, but it doesn't act. It can't act, really. And I've only read this morning that the next elections will be in mid or 20s or so February. So there's not only one, but there are many lame ducks about. And this is in a situation where there's war in Europe, where America is trying to reinvent itself, and where we have clear statements by Trump that he wants to become, or could happen, or I don't have the exact quote, but he could. The dictatorship is not the worst idea, he said, or something like that. And we have these written documents that I mentioned, the Agenda 47 and this statement for 2025, written by these extremely conservative and backwards orientated group of supporters. So very hard to say at the moment, and very frightening, to be honest, because Germany used to be the most influential and powerful country in Central Europe, and it certainly is not at the moment. And the other thing you pointed at was whether our foundation can sort of deal, or is dealing with, the public stigma whilst thinking of the past. I mean, as I said, the wonderful thing about the wall is that there is a positive message. That is really, that differs from a ordinary institution that is dealing with dictatorship. In our case, it's this message: walls, or those systems and regimes that build walls only buy time. They do not solve the political problem behind it, why they had to build a wall. So they built time, and walls are not built forever. So in that respect, our sites are sites of hope for very many people. And only this last Friday night, there was a great reception carried out by the Berlin Senate, and there were opposition leaders from, I think, 17 countries. From Iran, there was from Belarus, from Cuba and other countries, and for them the Berlin Wall meant hope. This is amazing, and this is the international symbol for hope that dictatorships can be overcome, and that in the end, finally, at the end of the day, democracy not only prevails but wins. And so that's probably the contribution we can make.
Excellent. Right, we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask, you look like you wanted to say something. Did you want to say something? Yes. No, okay. No. Would anyone from the audience like to? Yes. Please identify yourself.
Yes, hello, I'm Flora Ferrati-Sachsenmeier. I am a research affiliate here at the Weather Center on a cluster work in identity politics. And I found it very interesting, Axel, how you mentioned the issue of how 1989 as a symbol, as a revolutionary year for most of Europeans, and a shorthand sort of for the fall of communism. And I would like to hear your opinion on how to reflect about it, because as we know, Eastern Europeans claim a lot of credits for what happened in 1989. That's before the wall fell, especially the Poles. So on the other hand, they look at it as a symbol of Europeanness, as a triumph of democracy over communism in a wider Europe in a sense. In Germany, as someone who spent time there living, and in recent years, I have the impression that we are often in our new national narratives. We think of it as a kind of national remembrance, history, a narrative. And I was wondering how the foundation is dealing with this historical legacy of Europeanness, remembering the 1999, and how would you engage with these arguments, like from the Polish people, let's say, of how they think about their contribution to what happened that led up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question, and it's just as you had been present this last weekend, because it's true. I mean, we have very often discussed this fall of the wall as a national event, national only, and our foundation, we have actually started thinking about what can we do this year, what is different, and why in this completely different world, not only since the war started in Ukraine in February 22, but what should we include in our narrative? And it has always been my one of the key things I wanted to contribute. And we had invited members of the Solidarność movement, founders of the Solidarność movement to Berlin, and they were with us for 4 days. And in June this year, we signed a cooperation contract with the Solidarność Center, and here it is. Here is the folder of the Solidarność Center in Gdansk. And so we work closely together because we want to open the perspectives. We want to, and there's so much still to discover and to do. We have a sort of a befriended institution that is constantly doing exchange programs with colleagues from various countries in the former Eastern Bloc, be it Romania, be it Poland, Albania, wherever. And we do that. And in terms of Poland in particular, we have now established this exchange program. We bring young people to Berlin. Our Berliners go to Poland, especially Gdansk, of course, to learn about this common European heritage, because it's not just Berlin, it's not just Germany. This is only the most and best known symbol of the Cold War. Therefore, we have to think more internationally, and this is why we also produced a traveling exhibition with a Spanish institution that was opened last year in Madrid. It will come to the States later next year. It has now been in Madrid for a year. It goes to Paris, and from Paris to, at the moment, is Kansas City is being discussed, but beyond, after Kansas, it will be California. So we'll see. So international dimension of the wall, but the conflict between the international dimension of the conflict between the superpowers, and what does it mean for us today in this completely, that's what we do. Of course, we maintain our sites, and that's one of the key things we have to do. But in terms of developing and broadening our minds and interpretations, the international dimension is the next step, yes.
Any more questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, sure. I'm Dan Toner. I was living in Vienna up until a few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Unfortunately, I missed it. I lived there for a total of 5 years. So a major difference between Austria and West Germany was that Austria was never required to examine its past, the Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So I guess my question is, how is the history of East Germany taught in German schools now? Is there anything similar to the way, the admirable job that Germany has done with examining its Nazi history?
Yeah. Well, I believe, I must say, there's still a lot to do and a lot to be done. Very much depending on the school form, very often it ends with 1945. But now new ways of teaching history have been developed, and they now try to start with now and then going back
which means, which I find, from my chronological brain and understanding, very difficult. But you can, of course, start with democracy today and go back to the Greeks. But that is certainly more difficult than the other way around. But to your question, in grammar schools and so forth, the GDR history is a key part, a vital part of being taught. But what does it mean? Key part means something like 6 lessons a year. What do you do in 6 lessons a year? You might be you might have understood after that that the world was divided, and there was some basic information on how the world was divided and how it ruled. But yeah, there must be done. But it's for us as an außerschulischer Lernort, an extracurricular site of education. It's certainly very important to attract more schools. And even, I mean, there is not a single chair in our country that teaches the German division or GDR history or German history in general. Not a single chair. You have many chairs for of course, I mean, the dimension and everything is different, but for Nazi history and anti-Semitism and so forth. And that is only right that it is so, but there's no chair on this part of history. And I believe it's getting more and more difficult to establish that.
All right, well, on that sobering note, Axel, I would very much like to thank you for such a thoughtful talk at a difficult moment. I think you expressed, on the one hand, the concerns that we're facing, the importance of remembering this history as a source of strength for the future, but also remembering to celebrate this incredible moment and the bravery of the people who brought it about. So we're very grateful to you. I know it was hard for you to fit this into a very busy schedule. You should probably be on vacation after running the events last week.
Well,
but
I will be.
But instead, you were willing to come here and talk to us, and we are very grateful to you. So please join me in thanking Axel.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you.